I came to the agency in 1995 as a director of a loan program called the Minnesota Rural Finance Authority, and have been with the Commissioner's Office since about 1999. And I've been really privileged to work with our new Commissioner, Dave Frederickson. Dave is not really a new Commissioner, he's been with us for 2 years. And I bring greetings on behalf of Commissioner Frederickson because he's been a great person to work with. He's got a great skill when it comes to ag issues. He was a former Minnesota president of the Minnesota Farmers Union for 4 years, and then he also served a term as a president of the National Farmers Union organization for another 4 years. So he's obviously a very seasoned individual when it comes to ag issues, and I'm very happy to work with him and happy to talk about the work and the mission of our agency. And as I started to look at the work of our agency over the course of history, it occurred to me that our agency was really developed about the same time or progressed as well as agriculture has progressed. So when agriculture over the years has made new advances or new advances in technology, our agency has been right there to help assist in that efforts. And when most people think of Minnesota, they might think of our state as the land of 10,000 lakes. But for those of us with an agriculture background, we might add that our state is a national leader in the production of crops and livestock, and we are also a pioneer in the development of renewable fuels. Minnesota is really very, very fortunate to have a very robust agricultural economy. Agriculture is the second largest economic driver in this state. It supports 342,000 jobs and creates $74 billion in economic activity. $74 billion in economic activity, that's the second largest driver in the state. So this morning, I'd like to highlight a couple of events that have led to that level of success, and then talk about how some of those events have influenced the role and the mission of our agency. And it's really a very interesting story. When you look at Minnesota agriculture in the early days, like from the 1800s, late 1800s to the early 1900s, wheat was the predominant crop. At that time, we had about, I believe it was about 3.4 million acres of wheat, and the average yield was 16 bushels an acre. And wheat was a dominant crop, and Minneapolis was known as the mill city because it had 4 flour mills. Those 4 flour mills were located right along the St. Anthony Falls, and so we were led the nation in the production of wheat. But throughout the 1990s, and farmers were looking for another alternative to wheat and some other route to profitability. And that's when they started to add livestock production to their systems. And I'm going to talk about a couple of events that help promote the development of livestock and the marketing of our livestock industry. But I think the story really begins with a lot of our ancestors, and I like to share the story of my great-great-grandfather. When you think about one of the major events that brought prosperity to our state, it was actually the railroads, or the westward expansion of the railroads. And in 1872, the Winona and St. Peter Railroad, this railroad right out behind us here, was completed to Ghent, Minnesota and Lyon County. And at that same time, Archbishop John Ireland of St. Paul was contacting farmers in Belgium and Holland, encouraging them to invest or buy land in Minnesota. They could actually buy land, 160 acres in Minnesota, for about $2.50 an acre. And the farmers in Belgium and Holland, they were struggling with scarce land, and so many of the families there were looking for a new opportunity or a new investment. So my great-grandfather, John BOERBOOM, and his wife, Teresa, and their 5 children decided to make an investment in Minnesota land, and they bought property in Lyon County. Well, then they took the long journey to travel from Holland to Lyon County, and when they got to their farmstead, they thought they would, they were expecting to find a home for a dwelling, and rather than a home, they found a small granary. So many of our early settlers had to endure a lot of difficult times in order to provide the type of farming operations that I remember as a youngster, as some of the farming operations you see today. Well, the story ended in a good note because John was not only a farmer, but he was a brickmaker, and he found clay along the banks of 3 Mile Creek, and so he was able to make brick to build the first home for his family. So it's interesting, again, how these immigrants and these early settlers came with their skills and brought those skills to our state. When going back to wheat, wheat was one of the early crops that farmers grew, and it was primarily because it was an easy crop to grow, and we were set up to move that crop back to Minneapolis for processing, and so it was, again, a fairly easy crop to grow, but it did have its challenges. Wheat was subject to grasshopper infestation, cinch bugs, and some of the poor growing conditions of the late 1880s that made it a very poor crop. So farmers were looking for another opportunity to profitability, and this really prompted the growth of the dairy industry. The dairy industry, or the number of dairy cows in 1860 was about 40,000 cows. That's all the state had, a number of dairy cows. But by the end of World War II, the number of dairy cows in our state actually went up to 1.8 million head of cattle at the end of World War II. Right now we're at about 480,000 dairy cattle. So it just shows this huge progress that the dairy industry made largely in the late 1800s to the early 1900s. And it was another effort, I think, on the part of our Minnesota farmers that brought that level of prosperity. And that second effort of prosperity was the cooperative marketing effort of our Minnesota farmers. We don't realize how much influence the cooperative marketing model had on our Minnesota economy. And I didn't realize this until I read a book by Ken Rubel called Men to Remember: How 100,000 Neighbors Made History. And it talks about the history-making struggle of the dairy farmers to develop their farms in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. And farmers were looking for a new alternative to wheat, and they realized that Minnesota, because of its cool climate, lakes and streams, and grasslands, it was really well adopted toward the dairy industry. Well, there were three technical changes that helped advance the dairy industry, and the first one was actually the introduction of the centrifugal cream separator. That cream separator allowed farmers to sell sweet cream butter rather than sour cream butter. Prior to the separator, cream was separated by hand. It was allowed to sit in containers and it turned sour, and they made sour cream butter out of it. But sweet cream butter was actually a much better product, so the separator helped advance that. The second event was the invention of Dr. Babcock did the Babcock test. And for those of you who took high school ag, you probably did the Babcock test. It determines the butterfat content of milk. And by the butterfat content of milk, then you could determine the relative value of a cow. So a farmer could make a good decision about which cows to keep and which cows not to keep. And then the third event that really helped propel the dairy industry to a higher level of income was a very bright, innovative public official named Theophilus Hacker, or T.L. Hacker. And for any of us who have been a graduate of the St. Paul campus, you know that Dr. Hacker's name graces one of the university's one of the buildings on the University of St. Paul campus. Well, Dr. Hacker was a lifelong innovator, and it's interesting if you listen to Ken Rubel's description of Dr. Hacker. He said he was a slim, compact man with a shaggy black hair, an unruly mustache resembling a pair of turned-down handlebars, and a high-pitched, raspy voice. So you kind of look at the image of this person, you think, how does this person have such an influence on farmers? But he was really almost an evangelist in his passion for the dairy industry. He learned butter making from his German mother. His mother immigrated from Germany, and he learned butter making from her. And then he went to the dairy school in Madison, and as soon as he went to that school, the assistant recognized the skills of Mr. Hacker, and so they made him an assistant. And then in 1891, Governor Pillsbury, who was former governor of Minnesota, encouraged the Board of Regents to have Professor Hacker come to Minnesota. But Professor Hacker took that opportunity, came to Minnesota, and then in 1891 he did the first survey of the dairy industry in the state, and he did that by driving through the southern parts of the state in an old buckboard. And I can almost bet that he traveled through Waseca County. If you can imagine him traveling through the Waseca County, going farm to farm in an old buckboard. And what he found was that the state of the dairy industry was really in a dismal state, just a very poor state of condition. And one of the things that he did to improve the conditions of the dairy industry was to set up a feeding herd at the University of Minnesota and look at feed performance and breeding traits and weather conditions, all those factors that influence the profitability of a dairy cow. And then he shared that information with farmers. This was also at the same time when, as the dairy industry was growing, surplus butter and cheese were going to those East Coast markets by rail, that set the stage for one of the greatest contributions of Professor Hacker. And he did manage in that early tour of the state to find two very notable success stories. One of them was at the Clark's Grove Creamery and another one at Biscay, right down the road. So he found, again, a cooperative model in Clark's Grove and Biscay, and the farmers there were getting 2 and 3 times the price for their butter versus other places. And it was a cooperative model that he found that was really leading to that level of success. So this really prompted him to aggressively promote cooperative marketing, as well as, you know, the feeding trials and the breeding trials and all the other things. So it's really fun to look at and read a story about a pioneer, a public official that helped propel the livestock industry to where it is today. But also more than 100 years later, we still enjoy the cooperative model that he promoted and advanced back in the late 1890s. Well, there are many other events that influenced the role and the mission of our agency. It was, again, in 1885 that the legislature created our predecessor. We were known as the Minnesota Dairy Commission. And our role in 1885 as an agency was to prevent the sale of adulterated milk. We're still working on that today, as a matter of fact. But the commission had 3 people, 3 staff. It had a department head, an assistant, and a clerk, and the clerk acted also as a chemist. Just for comparison, today we're at about 430 employees, and we have an annual operating budget of about $40 million. So that just gives you a size scale of the size of the agency we are today. In 1885, the legislature also gave us authority to inspect and license grain, or we licensed terminal warehouses and inspect and grade grain. In 1889, we were changed to a new name, which is called the Minnesota State Dairy and Food Commission. So instead of just dairy products, we were at food products was added to our regulatory oversight. And then in 1906, we were given authority to regulate the new canning industry in the state. So those are some of the changes that have occurred in the early 1900s. And then we had a major change that occurred to the state of Minnesota and our agency in 1919. This was at the end of World War I. Commodity prices had collapsed. Butter markets, cheese markets, grain markets were a fraction of what they were during the war. And the legislature was looking for another way to promote the sale of agriculture products. Well, they went back to the cooperative marketing model that Professor Hacker had advanced back in the late 1800s. And the cooperative marketing model is still in our statutory language today. And I'm just going to read under the chapter 17.03 under the duties and powers of the commissioner. This is a statement that was, again, passed by the 1919 Minnesota legislature when it renamed our agency the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. And it says, the commissioner shall encourage and promote the development of agriculture industries, investigate marketing conditions affecting the marketing of farm products, and assist farmers, producers, and consumers in the organization and management of cooperative enterprises and cooperative marketing of farm products. A very, very strong endorsement to the cooperative marketing system. They saw this, the legislature saw this as a solution to the very hard times and the depressed prices at that time. There are several other events subsequent to that time, as some of you have heard or lived through the 30s. Corn sold for 6 cents a bushel in the 30s. We had drought conditions. There was at that time in the late 30s that hybrid seed corn was developed, and our agency was given authority to regulate the sale of that hybrid seed corn. We were also given authority to do inspection of wholesale produce. So any of the wholesale products like potatoes and melons and apples, those kind of products that come into our state, we have a team of people that inspect those products in the warehouse. World War II was another benchmark, as at that time after World War II, we saw farmers start to adopt the use of commercial fertilizers and herbicides. And here we were again given the authority to asked fertilizer dealers to file a certificate with our agency, and also we were given authority to regulate the spraying and the dusting of crop herbicides. The 1960s was a time when we saw surplus commodities. I remember as a youngster in Lyon County that my dad would set aside some land for the Freeman acres, or the Freeman set-aside. It was Orville Freeman was Secretary of Agriculture for President Kennedy and Johnson, and at that time they were dealing with a surplus of agriculture products, and so the way to manage that was to set aside some land or not to plant, and the government paid farmers not to plant. Of course, that's a much different model today. Then in the 1970s, we saw some unprecedented growth in both the international markets. We saw increasing land values, increasing commodity prices, some inflationary times during the 70s. And the legislature was looking at ways to make sure that we kept farm families in the business of farming. And so they passed the Corporate Farm Act. And our agency registers people or entities that are authorized to farm under the Corporate Farm Act. We got about 4,000 entities. Probably many of you here today are registered with us as a family farm corporation or authorized livestock corporation. And then in the 80s, and this was a part of my work experience in the 80s, we saw probably one of the most difficult times, or one of the most adverse economic times that we've seen in agriculture, probably comparable to the 60s. The 80s, the land values lost their value maybe about 60% or 50%. The legislature was looking for ways to help farmers restructure those real estate loans. Many of our farmers were carrying debt that exceeded the value of the land, and they were trying to get them to stay on the land or restructure that. So the legislature did create the Minnesota Rural Finance Authority, and when I came to the agency in 1995, that was my work activity. And actually, as a member of the Minnesota House, I served one term back in the 1980s. It was during that time that we created the Rural Finance Authority. So it's been very interesting for me to see this program be the success it is, having worked through it or worked with it as a legislator. Also in the 80s, we saw the passage of the Minnesota Groundwater Act. One of the things that we do in our agency is we monitor groundwater for herbicided products. And a lot of those monitoring wells are in southeast Minnesota, all the way through the Sand Plains, from Minoka all the way up through Fergus Falls area, where we have a lot lighter soils and there's more intense irrigation in those regions. And so we monitor for nitrates and we monitor for other pesticide products. Then finally in the 1990s, we saw the ethanol producer payment. We did administer that. The first generation ethanol plants received a 20-cent a gallon subsidy from the state of Minnesota for the ethanol that they produced, and we were happy to administer that. And at the same time, we saw a lot of interest in locally grown produce, locally grown products, or specialty crop growers, and that's when the legislature created the Minnesota Growing Program. So we've got a lot of new events that have continued to happen from one decade to the next. And today our mission is very simply this: to protect the integrity of the food supply, the health of our environment, and the strength of our agricultural economy. And we do that through a wide range of services to producers as well as to consumers. On the farm site, you know, we inspect dairy farms as well as food processing facilities, feed processing facilities. And on the consumer side, if a consumer has a complaint about a misapplication of a pesticide, they can call us. If a consumer has an illness due to food poisoning, they can call us, and we work with the Department of Health to remedy that. So that's been a lot of work. We've had a great relationship with our Department of Health and University of Minnesota in tracking down foodborne outbreaks. But the one thing I want to close with or leave with you is how much I appreciate your work as a producer of crops and livestock. Because without your effort in spending money on feed and seed and fuel and fertilizer and making investments in machinery and equipment and breeding livestock or real estate investments, all that economic activity that I talked about at the beginning of my comments, that $74 billion, none of that would have happened, none of that would occur without you making that investment. So I just want to say thank you for the work that you do as a producer of agriculture products, and thank you for helping Minnesota be a strong, viable economy. Thank you.